Power is the only sector where demand is absolutely guaranteed for the next 20, 30, 50 years. And yet most investors don't know which companies truly stand to benefit from this, growing demand in this sector. This is such a fascinating sector to look at. And I think why a lot of investors have not been looking at it recently is because the prices had run up a lot previously. But now there's been a substantial cool down in prices in power sector across various segments. So in today's video, I'm going to talk about the various subsectors within power. That's power generation, transmission, and distribution. And I will briefly talk about companies in each of these sub-segments of the power. And this is because it's important to understand why I'm positive on the company and the subsector on which I'm positive. So it's really important to understand the various subsectors and how the power sector as a whole works. So somewhere in this video will be embedded my top pick in the power sector, and why you need to also understand the various segments of the power sector is because, India's electricity demand is growing at 7 to 10% annually. Although this year so far, the power demand has grown only 1%, and that too on a weak base of 3% growth in the previous year, which actually makes me even more positive because, we are at a fairly low growth in power sector, which is getting reflected in stock prices across the various segments of the power sector. So maximum demand is set to come from industrialization and manufacturing. And the way we are growing in numbers, there needs to be a lot of industrialization given how fast India is growing and how, the future looks and how much we need to develop. So watch this video till the very end because you'll understand how the power sector works, the various segments within the power sector, whether it's generation, transmission, and distribution. To make things really exciting, India's power sector is also set to grow from three key areas, which is EVs, electric vehicles, data centers, because India is becoming a hub of the data center for the world. Recently I was listening to Piyush Goyal, who said the world is going to move their data into data centers operated out of India because of certainty of electricity supply and how much capacity we can build. And then there is, of course, manufacturing boom. So for the purpose of this video, let me break down the power sector in three subsegments, as I said. First being power generation companies, which is, again, you could break it down into generation companies which generate electricity from thermal sources, hydro, and solar. And then there is companies which do all of it, mixed companies. So, on thermal, there's NTPC and Adani Power and JSW Energy. And in hydro, you have SJVN and NHPC, where stock prices have gone up from 25-30 rupees to at 1.140, and now they've cooled down and come down to about 70 rupees. But I still find that very expensive. The key to this sector is that, first of all, I think a lot of people are confused about power storage. So, when you talk about power storage, there is no concept of storing power. When you talk about companies like NTPC or Adani Power or JSW Energy or Tata Power, companies that produce power using thermal sources, the storage is coal itself. So it's not like they can produce electricity and store it in some kind of stabilizer and supply it when needed. The coal is lying there, and whenever there is demand, they just start boiling, water, and they start burning coal. And think of it like your house has a bulb. You switch on the light, and in real time, the moment you switch on that light, in real time, the coils start turning where the power is being made. So, I'm not going to get into the scientific details of how the coils which are rolled onto the stabilizers work. But just remember that, because this is important for later, for storage, for thermal, coal itself is the storage. For hydro and solar, for hydro, for example, you have a reservoir. So the water falls down, and then when it falls, it starts rotating the coils, and you have a pump. Whenever there is need for power, the pump pushes back water on top of the reservoir. It falls again and then starts rotating the coil. So the storage is water itself. So the only true storage that you're talking about is batteries. And I'm going to come to that, but batteries should not be confused, whether it's lithium ion batteries or now sodium ion batteries, which India is making, because we have a lot of sodium, and that's the goal. But even if you talk of EV batteries, that's not power generation, because those batteries need to be charged. So power generation companies will always be power generation companies. EVs are not a threat to them. This is something I thought a lot of people get confused with, and this is something I should put out. So, when you talk about power generation companies, they make most of the revenue through long-term power purchase agreements, which basically are signed with state electricity board. So this is the revenue split that they have. If you look at this, 70% of their power comes from state discoms. About 10% comes from industrial and corporate power purchase agreements, which they sign with big industrial houses and stuff. Then there is 5% power, which they trade on exchanges like IEX and stuff. So that's 5% of their revenue, and about another 15% comes through state electricity corporation. So the long-term visibility of revenue is very, very solid for these companies, but then it comes with its own set of negative implications. First of all, power generation is an extremely capital-intensive, high debt, high capital guzzling business. So profitability depends on fuel prices, the kind of power purchase agreements you can enter into. In fact, a segment of power generation companies which is doing really well over the years are renewables now. It's been so many years because these are very low variable cost businesses. They're built with very low capital expense because there's no fuel expense involved. And these generation projects have long asset lives. Once you build them, they go on for 40 plus years, which is true for any power project, whether it's thermal, solar or hydro. So, renewables in generation is something that I really like. So coming to the next segment of the power sector, once the power is generated, it's produced, it has to be transmitted to the state electricity boards and the ultimate consumer who's going to consume that power and pay for it. And this is done by power transmission companies. And this is the segment where I'm really positive, and I'll talk about why. So, examples of companies operating in this segment are majorly it's Power Grid, but now you have Torrent Power, you have Adani Energy Solutions. So private players are coming into it. Why I like this segment the most is that first of all, they build and maintain high voltage transmission lines, but once they're built, it's like annuity revenue that they're going to earn. So they neither produce power or nor do they sell power. They just transmit power. So you see these high voltage lines going next to the highways. Those are the transmission lines. And these are, you see those huge poles with transmission lines going next to the highways. They're just like highways. They're highways for power. All they do is they charge a certain tariff for transmitting power from the power producing plant, which is the generation company, to its ultimate destination, which is, from where state electricity boards take it. So they just charge a little tariff for doing that business. And how they make money is it's a regulated return on equity. There is long-term visibility of revenue because it's essentially government contracts. It's the lowest risk companies in the whole power sector because they're like you can consider them like bonds, annuity income, because irrespective of power demand, they make that money so long as there is power which they're transmitting. How they earn additional revenue, if at all, is when newer power transmission lines are added. And I'm going to come to that when I talk about the TBCB, which is tariff-based competitive bidding, which is, how they bid for projects and how they win projects. So, talking of tariff-based competitive bidding, what that really is, earlier the government would negotiate the price at which power would be transmitted by these transmission companies from, power production to its ultimate destination. But with private players coming in, they decided to have a competitive bidding process. So they came up with something called tariff-based competitive bidding. The process is really simple. The government identifies a new project and it says, for instance, they have to build a power transmission line from Guwahati to Tezpur. All the power transmission companies are asked to bid and they appoint a central bidding coordinator. Everybody places their bids and the one who bids the lowest gets the project. It's just as simple as that. Typically, the return is very regulated in this sector, and that's why I said the return is 14 to 16%, because the government allows for these companies to charge both the power producer, which is the power generation company, and the state electricity board a certain amount, which is to recover the cost of building the infrastructure. And that they will get no matter what happens. So whether stock markets are up or down, whether there is demand which is weak or strong, that they're going to recover. In addition, they're going to charge a small tariff for transmitting that power. So once the project is awarded and built, they will keep making that margin that they make. So what I like about this project is, if you're a long-term investor, this is the safest long-term compounding you can get, because this is one segment of the power sector which is fairly unaffected. It's, as I said, annuity-like income. So you should look for companies in this sector which are available at reasonable valuations, because, you should not hope to make many-fold return. You should not hope to make that the company will start suddenly growing at 20-25%. How it adds additional revenue and grows and creates that alpha is if it gets awarded newer and newer projects. And that's where I'm really positive, because the speed at which the government is trying to connect various places and supply power to various places, there will be a lot more projects which will be awarded, a lot more places which will be connected. And, there are newer players entering in the market. Like, as I said, Adani Energy Solutions, there is Torrent Power, there is Tata Power, but there is Power Grid, of course. But personally, I think private players would not want to, get too aggressive in this space, because it's expensive to build those transmission lines. So personally, if you ask me, this is a business which is run by the government and should be run by the government. You have Adani Energy Solutions coming into this business. 5 years, 10 years later, what is the certainty that they will retain those power transmission lines that they build? Because, government contracts, how they work. Power Grid is a government-owned company, and that's why I like Power Grid the most. This is a stock that I'm recommending. We've added this to our portfolio. How you should look at the stock is there's a certain price point below which it becomes attractive and certain price point above which it becomes a little expensive. So when you look at the financials for Power Grid, there's two things that you should look at. First, the speed at which the sales are growing. Second, the price to earnings multiple at which it is trading. So have a look at this chart. The price to earnings multiple for Power Grid right now is around 15.5. And, the historic price to earning multiple is around 11. But keep in mind, as you see in this chart, the blue bar graphs that you see, that's the sales growth. That's the EPS number. So earnings have not been improving, because of which the stock price has come down, and, the price to earnings multiple has been falling. I expect the whole number to increase from here, because, if you think about the reasons for why this number was falling in the first place, particularly since 2023 till now, this year, there has been a prolonged monsoon and the summer season was slightly smaller. So, there was less demand for power, lesser use of air conditioning, and manufacturing activity had come down. So that's why power demand had reduced. And so transmission, the amount they were transmitting had also come down. But if you look at their sales number, which is what I was talking about, if you look at their sales number here, since about 2014 till 2023, they were consistently growing their top line number. But if you see March 22, then March 23, March 24, March 25, and until now, you'd see it's flattish sales. I expect this to start growing, because, as I said, this year, so far, the growth in power demand has been just about 1%, which is typically growing at 7 to 10%, should be higher than 7 to 10%, given that, as I said, there's a lot more demand coming in from EVs and data centers and manufacturing activity. So all that would stabilize going forward. At 261 rupees a share, what I would say is start adding this share. If you like annuity income with a potential upside from here, very, very safe stock to add to your portfolio. Yes, it could fall to 230. It could go to 300 also. But at a very, very sweet spot, I don't know when things will turn around for this company. I'm pretty sure that they will get a lot more of these new power projects which the government keeps awarding. In fact, they just got awarded one just recently, about a week back. And I think that is what will add alpha to the stock price. Be that as it may, at this price, this is a very, very attractive stock. Also, it has an extremely attractive dividend yield at the price at which it's trading. It's paying a dividend of about 3.5%, which is fairly good. So I think the way to add this stock is you add some, and then if it falls a little more, you add a little more. I believe that this is one segment in the power sector which has not performed the way a lot of the power generation companies have performed. Like if you see SJV and NHPC, those companies have done phenomenally well. Some of the stocks have grown 6 to 7 times, 8 times in the last 4, 5 years. And transmission has not kept speed with that. It's only a matter of time that it will. And as I said, whether it's EV battery charging or it's any other type of power demand, transmission lines are here to stay. So, before I go on to the distribution companies, which is the third segment of the power sector, I think it's important that I talk about this one thing, because I see a lot of people, particularly on Twitter. I made a tweet and they tweeted back to me about that. A lot of people are getting confused with batteries replacing power generation. There's some confusion there. So you see, what batteries do is they store power. They in no way produce power, and transmission lines will still be needed to charge the batteries or the plants wherever they are, unless of course you're charging it using solar panels. So one of the reasons demand is also coming down is because people are installing a lot of solar panels above their houses or for their smaller factory outputs. And then for that, you don't need transmission line. It's literally solar power being supplied to your house. But that's a very, very small percentage. I don't see that making any dent at all in the long term. And as for lithium ion batteries, in case of interest, I'll just explain. So basically how the batteries work is there's lithium ion on one side and there's graphite on the other side. In fact, now they're planning to have sodium instead of lithium ion, because India has a lot of sodium, and lithium ion is, as you know, it's essentially all China, or it's all imported. So they're trying to experiment with sodium. The idea is to make these batteries more and more powerful. So electricity is pushed in from one side and it goes to the other. And in between there are electrodes. The process is called intercalation. So in between there are electrodes which get charged. That's how the battery is stored in those electrodes in between. So that's how batteries work, but they have nothing to do with power generation. You still need power from one side, which is being produced by one of those traditional means, which then gets supplied into these batteries. And that's how these batteries get charged. In the US, there's also a plan to supply this power from the batteries back into the grid. So, cars could be actually a huge storage device, but that's for another day. Maybe I'll do a video on that some other day. Right. So let me come to distribution companies. So this is mostly just for the sake of completion of this video, because first of all, none of the distribution companies directly, other than Tata Power, of course, are listed on the exchange, because Tata Power is into distribution in Delhi and in few other geographies. But distribution companies are the ones which supply power ultimately from state discoms to your house, and consumers pay for that. So the guy who pays for power is the ultimate consumer, and all these companies in the value chain up ahead, they're all making money from the consumer, whether it's the transmission lines like Power Grid or it's the power producers. Ultimately, it is supplied by the distribution companies to your home, to the consumer. Honestly, I don't like this space as much, because in India, there is so much power theft even right now that, this is a space best avoided. Anyways, there's not many companies listed in this space. So I would focus on transmission companies, and I really, really like Power Grid. So that was my view on power sector. It's a very exciting space. I've been looking at it for a while, whether it's generation, transmission, distribution, or even EVs. EVs I'm really positive on. In fact, the other space I'm really positive on is power exchanges. Recently with all the developments that are going on with, centralized pricing. So IEX stock has fallen a lot. And that's one stock where it seems to me like the whole of the country is stuck. Pretty much everyone's invested. It seems like that, because it looks like such a value buy. I think I'm going to do a video on that standalone at some point of time. Do let me know what you thought of this video. Leave a comment and let me know what you'd like me to make a video on next.